is Devin Foley with another episode of First Tuesday Conservatives Countdown to the Election, co-hosted by Alpha News and Charlemagne Institute, of which I am the CEO. We publish Intellectual Takeout and Chronicles Magazine. Check them out. Today, our guest is John Augustine, who is with the LEA. They do evaluations of legislation, and he'll be here to share a little bit about, some of the big legislation that they've been tracking, what's going on with it, what's the good, what's the bad, all of that. So, John Augustine, thank you and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Devin, for doing this.
Absolutely. So now, we've known each other for many years, and then, of course, our kids are both in the same 4-H club. But right. The one thing I don't know is, how did you get involved in all of this?
Well, I have going back to before I was even an adult, I have a background in research and debate, and I did some work for campaigns, but then I drifted more toward covering campaigns. But reporting then and reporting now is not a particularly lucrative enterprise for people on not left of center around here. So I continued working in family business activities, but this was something I could still do as far as research and analysis. So I've been involved with the LEA, Legislative Evaluation Assembly of Minnesota, since before 2002. I've served on the board since about then, served as chairman of the board from 2011 to 2017, and I am still on the board now. I'm currently serving as vice chairman.
Very good, very good. And how long has LEA been around?
It was formed in 1972. It's a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, all volunteer, and it exists to inform the citizens about their Minnesota legislature and to evaluate the performance of the Minnesota legislature. So although we cover a broad range of issues, it has a pretty narrow focus. We're best known for putting out an annual report on the Minnesota legislature, which we released early this month. And we don't give money to candidates or endorse candidates. We do present awards to those that score highest in each year's report.
Very good. So with the report you just released, talk to us about, the biggest thing that you were tracking. I know you mentioned COVID as one of them and some of the emergency powers. Tell us about what's going on there and what may or may not be buried in there that people don't realize.
Well, it was obviously a major part of legislative activity this year in the Minnesota legislature. And so we devoted quite a bit of our annual report to covering it and analyzing some bills that were related to it. The annual report, by the way, can be obtained by going to www.lea-mn.org. But it is, so from the very beginning, it was kind of chaos at the very beginning when the emergency was first declared and so forth. Just like the bars and restaurants were shut down for 10 days, the legislature was pretty much shut down for 10 days. So they kind of held informal meetings that weren't, there wasn't a whole lot of oversight or transparency. You couldn't, they even met in, not in bipartisan fashion, so they could get around open meeting law initially.
I was going to say, yeah, because there are requirements for them to disclose.
Once the legislature resumed, they worked out some of these issues and they started doing Zoom meetings and those types of remote transmissions, just like almost everybody else has had to do. But initially, when they first met, it was the leadership of the various House, Senate, minority, majority, the governor's staff, a few supposed stakeholders or interests that they thought needed to be included in the discussion, and they formulated a plan, an emergency plan for how they were going to operate. And although the first emergency, the first restrictions maybe went into place for 10 days, couple weeks, the idea was to flatten the curve, and then when the executive council of which is basically all the elected statewide executive officers, Secretary of State, Attorney General, and so forth, they all ratified the governor's plan, and they ratify it for 30 days extensions at a time, and that's been going on ever since early March. But the way it was set up, even though it was set up initially that it was only going to be a couple weeks or a 30-day emergency, from the very beginning when the legislation was passed, a structure was created that allows the emergency to perpetuate itself. I mean, the emergency powers statutes, which date back to early in the 2000s, are not written in a way that is particularly good for balance of powers, separation of powers, in that the legislature effectively can only kind of veto what the governor wants to do. They can't, and that's just the opposite. The governor is supposed to be the one vetoing, and the legislature is supposed to be the one proposing and passing policy.
Right.
But the way it's set up, pretty much the governor and his key department heads are formulating all the public health policy, and only if the legislative leaders happen to agree that a particular policy is really a bad idea, if they can get an agreement among all those the group that gets to do it, not the whole legislature, but they've created a COVID-19, I want to give you the exact name so you can look it up. It's the COVID-19 Legislative COVID-19, Response Commission, okay? And that's made up of the Speaker of the House, the Senate Majority Leader, the House Minority Leader, the Senate Minority Leader, and a couple of Finance Committee chairs. And that's about it. So and the rest of the 201 legislators, they don't have any direct input at all into how this emergency policy is carried out. They may have, some of them, such as Senator Jensen, they may be physicians, or they may just have constituencies that they want to represent, but they have no direct input into the biggest issue of the year, which is this public health policy. The way it's set up, and I think that's wrong. As I mentioned, the executive branch is supposed to execute the laws, and the legislature is supposed to propose the laws. But that's not what's happening. Everything's originating from the executive branch.
Right, and John, it strikes me, okay, you're in a real emergency, and when the COVID outbreak hit, nobody was sure if this was going to be, the plague sweeping across the country, or a bad flu, or whatever. So I can understand having a short window of time where the executive branch has power to deal with something. Right. But what I'm hearing from you is that essentially the legislative branch surrendered their powers to the executive branch in an almost unending cycle.
Well, with the divided party control right now, that effectively is what's going on. I mean, the governors, the House controlled by the governor's party, they're not willing to defy the governor, even if they wanted to. They're not willing to do so, and without agreement from both branches of the legislature, it's going to continue. The other part of this, which I was just going to get to, is not just that the legislature has very little input into the policy, but the funding mechanism was set up, even though the original emergency might have been a couple weeks to a month. The accountability when it comes to the appropriations and the reporting of the appropriations and the ability time frame to use appropriations extended right through to the end of the year, and in some cases beyond, right from the beginning. And so this was an unanticipated emergency, obviously an economic emergency that creates major pressures and impacts on the state budget. So you think it would fall under the qualifications of having an emergency use for the rainy day fund, okay? Because it's in terms of economic, unanticipated economic emergencies. There's been a lot of rain this year, but but the thing about it is that in all these various COVID bills that they've passed, almost all of the money has come from the general fund, as opposed to this built-up budget reserve. Why do we have it if we're not going to use it for these types of situations? I mean, in the Minnesota statutes, and I don't want to go over reading the whole thing, but if somebody can look it up, it's 16A.152, budget reserve and cash flow accounts, how it's supposed to be used. And under subdivision 3, use, it talks about maybe used when there's a negative budgetary balance projected when objective measures such as reduced growth in total wages, retail sales, or employment reflect downturns in the state's economy that go beyond just a particular election or economic cycle. And so that's what we've got going on here, but yet they're not using that money, in fact, at all. And in fact, the Minnesota Management and Budget, at the end of last month, they put out their latest update on what the projected budget reserve was, and it's 2.377 billion. And that's almost identical to what it was before this whole thing started. So we're supposed to have this rainy day fund, but they're not using it. They're just adding more to the general fund instead, which is going to create further budgetary pressures down the road.
And what is the logic to that? Why wouldn't the governor and the legislature, in a true emergency when businesses are being crushed and tax revenue is collapsing, why wouldn't you tap into the emergency fund?
Well, when people are getting laid off and capacity restrictions, operational restrictions, and so forth, and everybody else is tightening their belts, why is the government not laying off a bunch of people or tightening its belt? You know, that's really what it comes down to. They try to delay any type of belt tightening on the public sector as long as they possibly can. I mean, even though an awful lot of government offices aren't, for practical intents and purposes, open for direct interaction by the public right now, the state public employees, there was an agreement negotiated before the pandemic began that gave them pay increases for years 1 and year 2 of the biennium. And yet, even after everybody else is belt tightening, the head of management and budget, which at the time was Myron Franz, with the support of the governor, pushed through the year 2 pay increase for the state employees. And when almost nobody outside of maybe some people at the big tech companies and a few other big companies is experiencing any kind of economic boom that's going to justify any type of increase in pay. So I don't, when they talk about everybody being in this together, I mean, I don't really see that they are. Some people are in this a lot more than others. You know, the small businesses and so forth, and it's tough that there just doesn't seem to be any resolve to try to make the decisions that obviously are going to have to be made sooner or later in terms of cutting some back on the state budget somewhat, because the revenues aren't going to keep coming in when everybody's businesses operations are severely reduced.
Oh yeah, I mean, most people are taking a beating right now unless you happen to be in something like telecom or you know, some sort of big tech where you're doing video work and things like that. ammunition and gun sellers are doing really well.
Right.
Stuff like that. But other people are just, I feel awful for a lot of small business people who are now on, month 10 almost of little to no revenue.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of disgusting that the state would see this as a moment to seize more power and not to trim its sails.
Right. So I mean, that's kind of the central issue that we analyzed this year. We analyzed a number of other issues: the insulin bill, the bill that they quickly pushed through in the second special session on police reform.
Yeah, can you speak more to what they pushed through on police reform? I know, we've spoken to a lot of local Minnesotans who are running for office, and what's come through, like every single person that's out there door knocking, interacting with constituents, all of that says people are worried about the economy, the sort of cultural Marxism and the culture war,
right,
and police. They are scared about all of this and feeling very unsafe, which is, we're looking at Philly and other places that are getting a taste of what happened in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So tell us, what does this police reform look like or empower them to do?
Well, it was a bunch of different ideas put together, which oftentimes violates the spirit, if not the letter, of the single subject rule in the state constitution. But just like they did it at the very last special session with the bonding and the tax provisions all put together, whatever they can do to get something done, regardless of whether it's constitutional or not. But aside from that, it's just I don't really see the evidence that if you're going to kick every investigation regarding use of force, officer use of force up to a higher level, as state or federal level, further removed from the people that were actually there to witness it, that it's going to result in better outcomes. And
so on the use of force, what's considered use of force? Is that a gun, or does it go to tasers, or having to physically arrest somebody? What do they say counts as a use of force issue to kick it up to a new level?
Let's see if I can quickly find that for you. Well, they're required to inform on other officers to the superintendent of the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension or at the FBI's request if they see use of force violations. I can't tell you right now exactly what they would be, but if some officer thinks that there might have been excessive force used by another officer, or if there's an officer involved, shooting investigation or something like that. I'm not an expert on that. I can't really tell you for sure. But in terms of the training, they tried to get everybody to accept the implicit bias training, which is really junk science, and they didn't quite get all of what they wanted there. So the radical reformers, but they did get. So that the arbitrators that are supposed to make the decisions, they have to undergo this implicit bias training. So they're supposed to look at, when they make their decisions, through this lens of implicit bias. There's also various interest groups that are not elected, and have no particular law enforcement training or expertise, that are empowered with advisory or decision-making ability throughout this oversight process as well. And that gets to be who decides who is going to be on these boards. It becomes kind of a, as it is with many of these boards, they just kind of pick various politically connected interests to have a representative on each of these, on each one of them have a representative on these boards, rather than, you know, some kind of random citizen oversight.
So on the oversight board, you could have, say, a nonprofit that, you know, is an anti-police organization, and they would actually be given power over the process of investigating a use of force situation.
Well, there's a 15-member community relations council created underneath the Peace Officer Standing and Training Board. Excuse me. So it's not, they're not directly on the Standards and Training Board, but again, there's some level of counsel that's put in there that's supposed to have input, but how that input is decided who gets it is, you know, it's basically assigned to politically connected interests that fit the various identity groups they're trying to appeal to. And you see that again with another thing that passed that same special session, which is in the House, which was the resolution declaring racism as a public health crisis. And, you know, a lot of these resolutions that, you know, local councils and so forth will pass about some national or world issue, or, you know, they're just kind of symbolic. They don't really have any effect. You know, why you're wasting your time, but maybe there's no real impact to them. But when a body of the legislature passes this type of resolution, I'll just quickly go over it here. It asserted that we need to reinterpret the history of racism in America, that racism is embedded in the foundation of America beginning in 1619, as if America is unique in having any kind of racist background or kind of slave heritage or anything. It asserts systemic racism and its science value based on how one looks. It resolves that the Minnesota House of Representatives will actively participate in the dismantling of systemic racism by assessing human resources, vendor selection, reviewing practices relating to hiring, promotions, and so here you got your quotas and so forth, and leadership appointments, and wants insert race-based criteria, so identity politics, race-based criteria, not treating everyone equally under the law, into future bills related to public health, family stability, early childhood education, economic development, public safety, housing, delivery of human services. So the whole range of services that we've decided the state government is supposed to have some input in providing is supposed to be redirected through this racial identity lens. And even though the Senate didn't pass this resolution, the House is acting as if this resolution is already binding on itself. Since this resolution passed, they've been holding, in the interim between sessions, they've been holding these systemic racism hearings and coming up with lots of identity groups testifying and issuing recommendations and so forth. And some of these actually made it into this giant bill that just passed the last special session, along with the bonding bill, where a whole bunch of different identity groups got some equity funding to resolve inequities, structural inequities and so forth. And so these the moral of the story is that these resolutions, I think some Republicans voted for it because they didn't think it was going to have much impact, and it would get some of the radicals off their backs or something, like they can really appease them. But the moral of the story is that these things do have an impact. And so the House went into the negotiations for this giant bill, this bonding and tax bill, with also this equity supplemental spending, and the governor supported it. And then the House passed it, and then the House adjourned. So the Senate had no ability to amend it, even if they wanted to, if they thought they needed a bonding bill. And so they basically railroaded it through. And it's all linked back to the resolution and all the stuff that's been ginned up afterward from as far as this, seeing everything through a lens of equality of results, and identity group reparations or compensation, instead of treating people as individuals and treating everybody as individuals is equal under the law. I mean, that's our constitutional heritage.
Right. So with this, in California, to my understanding, Governor Newsom put out an edict that government, various, government departments would have to have a racial makeup that matched percentage-wise the rest of the state, and essentially finding that too many whites were in positions of government, and they needed to be pushed out of government to bring in more diversity. Do you see? So is this the kind of effort that's laying the groundwork for those kind of actions?
Well, I think so. I mean, we're in a bunch of the whereases that were part of this resolution. It's talking about in race-based criteria, including for hiring and promotion and so forth. So yeah, I think that's a logical conclusion.
Wow.
So
wow.
There were some legislators that really stood out this year as being exceptionally good.
Yeah, let's hear some good news. So
yeah.
Tell me about some of the legislators that stood out and why they stood out.
Well, there were 4 House honorees this year, Representatives Cal Barr, Steve Drazkowski, Eric Lucero, and Jeremy Munson. And they all scored over 90%, which is higher than anybody scored on our report in 2019. So, I mean, our report's it's not impossible to get a perfect score, but it's not very easy to. I mean, that's a pretty significant achievement. And then there were also
so tell us a little bit about your criteria for that. What are you judging legislators on?
Every year we evaluate the legislators based on our credo. So we're not just talking about social and cultural issues or economic issues. I mean, I can quickly read it, I guess, but I mean, it's posted on our website and at the top of every one of our reports. We base our evaluation on the declared American founding principles of self-evident truths and inalienable rights, principles providing a basis for constitutionally limited government established to sustain life, liberty, justice, property rights, and free enterprise. So American traditions, and then the ideas that made our country great. So aside from the COVID bills this year, I mean, some of the other, and the police bill and the racism resolution, the insulin and the opiate bills, they were kind of micromanaging, inserting government into areas where it's not necessarily going to provide a better result than the market is going to provide if left to operate on its own. And in many cases, the market was already responding to the problems that had been created in part by patent changes and so forth many years ago. But we also commented on the bill to raise in Minnesota the minimum tobacco products age to 21, which is something that they pushed through last year at the federal level as part of some giant omnibus bill, but they also wanted to pass it here at the state level. And then it becomes a question of priorities. Is that really when 911 response times are just lousy in certain parts of the state, and there's all kinds of challenges when it comes to you know, enforcing laws that really impact and endanger other people and not just yourself. I mean, how much extra enforcement should we be devoting to this? It's tough on businesses and families too, in that, I mean, in the laws now for anybody under 21 going into a tobacco product shop are stricter than they are for going into a bar. And so if you just, you know, if you're a small business and you're stuck with this distance or hybrid learning right now with your family, and you've got a kid that wants to study or something, and that's your business, they can't even be there.
Really?
I mean, minors are not even with parental supervision or whatever, they're not allowed into the tobacco product shop. If a certain percentage of the sales comes from tobacco, then minors can't be there at all. But at the same, and at the same time that they're putting more fines on you know, ID check requirements and more fines and raising the age of purchase, for people who are adults, they can vote, they can enter contracts, they can make all these other decisions. But if you're 20 years old and you present false ID to try to get tobacco, or you do something else to illegally obtain or sell tobacco, you're not penalized. They remove the penalties on those people because they can't be held responsible. They can be held responsible for voting or entering into contracts or making a decision about whether or not to terminate a pregnancy, but they can't be responsible for making a decision about tobacco use. I mean, it's really backwards as far as we're concerned. So, I mean, there was renewable energy was another issue that came up. Energy transition grants. So we've got to make all these transitions to different types of energies. You know, just like Biden wants to transition away from ones that actually consistently provide energy, and we're now energy independent for the first time in who knows how long. But instead when we're having this economic downturn and everybody's struggling, we're going to impose these extra renewable energy mandates on people. So we oppose that.
I have to laugh, you know, on that subject. Every time I rewatch former Vice President Biden in that debate say, we're going to shut down the oil industry.
The transition from the oil industry, yes.
Yeah. I have to laugh because the moderator of the debate, the tone, why would you do that? It cracks me up because it sounds like the type of, like, the tone my wife or I would use when my child decides to try and, you know, pour a glass of milk from 3 feet up and it spills everywhere. Yeah, it kills me.
I've seen some good cartoons lately too, where people working at the oil rig or something, they have a picture of it, say, I'm going to transition my vote away from Biden. You know, so. But anyway, there were a couple of good things that passed.
Tell us the good. We need good news.
Yeah, in part, they were fixing mistakes they made a few years ago. They brought like eyelash technicians and so forth under the umbrella of cosmetology regulations, and that was just creating a regulatory nightmare for these people that do this as cosmetic type stuff that isn't really very impactful on health at all, but nevertheless we're being regulated to the extent that all the other cosmetology people were. So they kind of reversed that. That was much needed. They set up some procedures in terms of having to government entities having to obtain search warrants for drone and electronic tracking. There was nothing on the books at all, so they needed something. Because just because you're doing the search by drone or electronically, you should still have to have a search warrant, right? I mean,
yes, I would think so. Yeah,
it shouldn't impact your ability to violate people's laws against unreasonable search and seizure. So they started some requirements for obtaining search warrants for those things. They're very imperfect and have a lot of loopholes in them, but at least it's a step in the right direction. So those are a couple of things that they did.
Very good. Very good. Well, thank you for that, Sean. Now, the big news, I mean, what are you expecting or anticipating as some of the big issues moving forward for Minnesota? We've got 2 years left with Governor Walz, and I think that from what I've seen, a lot of the consensus is that he has shown very weak leadership, which I imagine that would mean the House may be more aggressive in what it wants to achieve. So are there any items that you're concerned about or keeping a close eye on?
I mean, the weak leadership isn't, to be fair, isn't isn't necessarily just confined to the executive branch. Obviously, I mean, as we see, the legislature overall scored higher this year than it did in 2019, but as a group, still scored well under 50%. There's, you know, we haven't really tightened in things on the public sector side yet at all, as the private sector has been forced to do. So I mean those budgetary pressures are definitely going to be there as soon as the new legislature begins, regardless of who's in control. The Senate kind of got outmaneuvered when it came to this year 2 pay increase for the public employees, in that they asked the governor's the administration to freeze pay for the second year, to not do it, but they weren't willing to vote down the entire contract. And basically, if you really wanted to have leverage, that's what they had to do. They had to, pretty early in the session, reject the entire negotiated agreement and force them back to the table to renegotiate one that has what you want, because they didn't have to modify it just because you wanted them to. And they knew that, right. and they outmaneuvered them. Then when it came to confirmation battles, you know, what people such as Jan Malcolm are, you know, wreaking all kinds of havoc on a lot of collateral damage on all kinds of people across the state with the health policies and regulations that the goalposts keep shifting well beyond just hospital capacity and flattening the curve. But there's been no effort to try to reject her confirmation. The first confirmations that anybody tried to reject in the last 10 years didn't happen until the third special session this year. So they had lots of time to do damage, and they didn't really use that confirmation power, except for they finally did use it on was it labor and commerce in the third and fourth special sessions. And then when nothing in the fifth special session, where we had the giant bonding bill. You can bet there's going to be a sixth special session lame duck for some of the legislators here right after the election, because every 30 days, Walz has to get the emergency plan reauthorized, and all these capacity restrictions and benchmarks for when schools have to switch from full-time learning to hybrid to distance. I mean, he doesn't have the ability to do all those things unilaterally if his emergency powers are gone. So naturally, he's going to want to keep extending them as long as he can. So we're going to keep having special sessions every 30 days until January, and then we'll see, depending on how the election turns out, whether they can genuinely provide some kind of counterpoint or at least have some input into these policy decisions that they currently don't have at the legislative level.
What is, do you have a sense of tax revenue for the state, and how off, as far as percentage wise, that the state budget will likely end up in 2020?
Well, those numbers are out there. If we're not going, if it doesn't look like we're moving in the direction of allowing more things to open, as Florida has done, for example, then you said, well, yeah, there's going to be cases, but you know, try to protect the people most at risk and let the rest of the economy operate and help support everybody. We're not moving in that direction. The discussion all seems to be about what we're going to have further restrictions we're going to have here as we see spikes in cases. Cases, of course, are linked to testing as well as seasonal fluctuations. But so if I don't see how the economy is going to suddenly start recovering with all those in effect. And so I mean, they've already had many of reductions in the projections as far as revenues coming in. I think you're going to see more of that. But
how low are the projections? Are they projecting, let's say, 10% off, or is it 20% off? Is it more significant?
I can't recall off the top of my head, but if you go to Minnesota Management and Budget or the Commissioner of Revenue, I mean, they periodically issue news releases that will give you updates on that type of stuff. So
okay, no, totally understood. So.
You know, and depending on whether we have divided legislative control next year, will have an impact on whether some types of legislation get passed. I mean, the House passed a couple of different gun control measures this year that the Senate didn't take up, but you can be sure that if they get control of the Senate, you're going to see those. And
what were those, do you recall what those gun control measures were?
Well, you've got your so-called red flag laws, the emergency risk protection orders, but due process really isn't there on these types of things. In terms of, I mean, I encourage people to look at the annual report again at the lea-mn.org for the analysis here, but it's you can even, if you decide, if they get the judge to decide, petition the court that somebody's enough of a risk to themselves or others, they can take away firearms even before there's a hearing for 14 days. So even before there's any type of proceeding. That's called an extreme emergency risk protection order. These other ones, you know, if the standard thing is that there's supposed to be a hearing within 14 days, but the shall issue premise that was passed years ago here, that, you know, somebody has a permit, lawfully obtains a permit to possess a firearm and carry a firearm, it's not at the whim of individual sheriffs or police chiefs or county attorneys, and this would be rolling that back in the other direction. So gun transfers would be harder even among family members and all that type of stuff.
Got it. Well, thank you, John, for this update. Do you have any predictions for Tuesday coming up?
Well, our election laws are very, very lenient in terms of how they allow people to vote and what kind of scrutiny there is toward ballots and voting locations and identification and all that. So if as most of us think it is going to be a fairly close election, it doesn't make me real optimistic in a close election how it's going to turn out. Another disadvantage we have, and I hate providing so much bad news in one talk here, but another disadvantage we have, as opposed to some of these states, even Wisconsin, for example, we don't have a court system that's effectively, when we're challenging some of these extreme emergency orders and some of these decisions, the courts have been so much composed and appointed by people on the left progressive end of the spectrum for so long that we're not really getting much of a hearing in these courts. And even when the Democrats put together a law or push a law that's designed that they instituted, for example, this law about the Wellstone passing, that there was going to be a vacancy, right? So then there's not right for people to have to vote for somebody when there's a vacancy created during the election process. So we're going to have a special election. But this year, when the special election would have been required by law, the state law, they sensed that they had a better chance to win if we just had the election on time in November. So, we don't really care what our own principles were when we passed it. If the result is better, that we can get a better chance of winning by just having the election now, then we're going to try to push for that. And sure enough, that's what we're going to get. So we don't get a lot of support in the courts, and our election system, the procedures and safeguards and so forth are not very good compared to some other states. So if it's really close, that on the margins, it's going to be harder for the conservatives and libertarians and so forth to prevail on the margins if it's a really close outcome.
That's what I've heard. And my understanding is that they can count absentee ballots up until November 10th, I believe it is.
Well, that's how it's set up right now through this consent decree that was negotiated between the Secretary of State and these left of center interest groups and approved by the court. There's no adversarial process there. It's just like these labor management negotiations when somebody who's supported 100% by the public employee unions is on the management side. There's no adversarial negotiation at all. So right. Whereas Wisconsin just got that thrown out, I don't know if the courts in Minnesota are going to go the same direction because our courts are not as good. So, but that's it's being appealed at the federal level, so maybe it will. But people still knew when the election was, and whether they're working or not, they can still get a ballot in. So I don't understand why they had to have all these extensions on when the election counting had to end. But that's where it's set up right now. So.
Yeah, it seems fraught for abuse, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. So, well, John, thank you so much for giving us your time. Say again where folks can find the LEA report.
It's lea-mn.org, and I just want to reiterate that it's an all-volunteer grassroots organization. So it's $10 to become an annual member, and anybody who's an annual member gets invitation to the banquet annual meeting where we have a keynote speaker, present awards. We're going to try to do that again this year anyway. Who knows how the restrictions are going to impact that, but anybody who's a member has input into the annual meeting where the members elect a board of directors that is tasked with overseeing the production of the next report. So it's all grassroots driven, and we can always use more people involved, beyond just the immediate campaigns and elections that are looking for our information, educating and informing, and the unique value that has, and we encourage more people to try to participate and join our organization, not just as members, but potentially as advisors or even board members.
Very good. Well, for all of our listeners and viewers, if this is something that you would like to get involved with, reach on out to John Augustine at LEA. Go to their website.
I'm the chairman, but yes, go ahead and reach out to us.
Very good. All right. Well, John, thank you so much for being with us. This was very insightful. Not all of it happy news, but that's okay. We're Minnesotans. We're conservatives in Minnesota, and we have thick skin, and we understand the odds. So yes, we do. All right. Well, this has been another episode of First Tuesday Conservatives Countdown to the Election. co-hosted by Alpha News and Charlemagne Institute, of which I am the CEO. Charlemagne publishes Intellectual Takeout as well as Chronicles Magazine. Just Google us and sign up for a membership as well, and you'll get a 12-month subscription for Chronicles Magazine. We have a lot more events and episodes coming up, so check your email, look out on Facebook, and plan to be back. We've got another episode tonight at 6:30. So thank you all, and thank you, John Augustine, for giving your time, and thank you especially for volunteering and just being such a good civic servant, really, and giving your time to inform and educate legislators and Minnesotans. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Devin, and thank you, Alpha News, for helping us.